Hey everyone, in today's video we're going to do a step-by-step installation of CV Fabrication's catted downpipes for the 2021 and up 2.7 liter Ford Bronco. This is a pretty big job if you want to keep the OEM downpipes intact. So if you're mechanically inclined weekend warrior, you can do this job by yourself, but it is much easier with an extra set of hands. Fortunately, my buddy Greg from YouModAuto is here to help with the installation. And on that note, if anyone of you is located in central North Carolina and need help installing modifications on your Bronco or really any vehicle, then hit him up. I'll leave his contact information in the video's description. I plan to do a full review on these downpipes with dyno results and more, so stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, here's a quick look at the quality of these downpipes when you pull them out of the box. Now these are made out of T304 stainless steel. They're 100% mandrel bent and they're fully TIG welded. They also come with 700 cell cats, which helps to avoid check engine lights. These are 3-inch downpipes and they come with everything that you need to install. I did, however, purchase the optional stainless steel exhaust gaskets just in case the OEM donut gaskets got damaged during the removal. I didn't end up using them, but they are an option if you want to order them. The last thing I wanted to mention is that I am an affiliate with CV Fabrication, so if you find this video helpful in any way, then please consider using my affiliate link that's found in the video's description and use code FULLSPEEDFordBronco to save 5% off the cost of these downpipes, or really any CV Fabrication products at all. This helps support the channel so I can produce more Bronco content for you all. Alright, with all that said, let's jump into it. Now the first step you're going to want to do is remove the negative battery cable. This will ensure someone doesn't accidentally start your Bronco while you're under it. And it's also a good idea to reset the ECU when you're doing performance modifications. Next, we'll remove both wheel well liners. I used a stubby Phillips head screwdriver and trim removal tool to remove all the plastic screws and retainer clips. You can use the same Phillips head stubby screwdriver to remove the screws closest to the fender flares. It's also a good time to remove the fender flares to give you more room to work with. Next, you're going to want to grab a pair of ramps or jack stands that are rated to support the weight of your Bronco. She's a heavy girl, so don't skimp here. Make sure to use wheel chocks behind the rear tires after you get the front up in the air. Moving on, if you have a transfer case skid plate, you'll want to remove it using a 15mm socket. There are 4 bolts here, but only 2 of them need to be removed, and those are the ones that are attached to the transmission cross member. The other 2 can just sit in the frame. You don't have to remove them, just loosen them a little bit and then just slide the skid plate right out. Now with the skid plate out of the way, grab a floor jack and add some either rubber or wood blocks on the top of the jack to give you more height. You're going to want to position the blocks right underneath the transfer case and then raise it just until it's supporting the weight of the transfer case. Next, it's time to remove the 8 bolts that hold the transmission cross member. Might also be a good time to spray some PB Blaster on these bolts, especially if you live in the Rust Belt. It actually might not be a bad idea if you want to spray these bolts the night before if they look really bad. The bolt head is 15mm and the nut is 18mm. You'll have to hold one side with a wrench while you ratchet the other. If you have a gas tank skid plate, then you will need to remove a number of the 15mm bolts as shown. Now before doing so, I would recommend grabbing a ratchet strap and then sliding it in between the skid plate and the gas tank, and then use it to ratchet up the gas tank just a little bit to support it. Here in the video I'm showing a jack stand with some blocks, but we didn't really end up using this because it wasn't as effective. You will need to pull down the front part of the skid plate in order to pry the cross member out. Next, you're going to want to grab a deep well 21mm socket and remove the 2 nuts holding the transmission mount. Now double check that you make sure your deep well socket is deep enough. The one I had wasn't, so I had to go run out and grab another, so check that before you start this installation. Okay, now it's time to bang and pry. You'll need a decent size pry bar and a rubber mallet to remove the cross member. I don't have any video of this since it did require all hands on deck, but I was able to bang the driver's side section of the cross member out with a mallet only, and then we had to pry the other side out with a large pry bar. Once the cross member is out, you can clean it up, and it might not be a bad idea to sand a little bit of the surface rust off and paint, but it's not required. With the cross member out, now you have a nice open area to work in. Let's jump over to the passenger side of the Bronco, and we're going to unclip both O2 connectors. Now there's one blue and one black wire. The blue wire is the downstream O2. The black wire is the upstream O2. It's easier to remove the connectors from the bottom of the Bronco. One of the clips also has an orange pull tab on that, so you will need to pull that back before removal. Next, you'll need to do the same exact thing to the driver's side, but you have a couple different ways that you can attack this. These connectors sit right on top of the transmission, so you can either try to get to the connectors from the driver's side wheel well, or you can climb on top of your motor and get to it from the very back. Here's a clear shot of the connectors, and then here's a shot with the connectors detached and removed. All right, it's time to start unbolting the passenger side downpipe from the turbo. You might find it easier to push this wheel well liner bracket out of the way. We actually broke one of the clips, but it really wasn't a big deal. Now you're going to want to grab a 15mm socket and ratchet to go to town on each side. We were able to remove both nuts from the wheel well, but the inside nut could be a little bit easier if you were to access it below the Bronco with a long extension and swivel socket. Ford does recommend disposing of the old nuts. I didn't have any new ones, so I just put the old ones back on, but you might want to pick up a set before you start this job. Moving over to the driver's side, the outside 50mm nut is easy to get to, but the inside, well, you're going to have to access it from underneath the Bronco. And here's a shot of the extension setup and swivel that I used to get underneath there. It's a little bit difficult to get to it, but once you have the correct extension and swivel setup, then it's really not too bad. Now that the downpipes are both unbolted from the turbos, let's remove the exhaust clamp on the Y section of the OEM downpipe. Now there's probably an easier way to do this, but we got the nut loose and then we kind of just pried it off. I don't plan on reusing this clamp, so if you want, you can be more tactful if you want to save it, but I just pried it off. Next, we're going to break loose the 15mm nuts on the flange that connects to the Catback exhaust. If I didn't mention it already, these downpipes will work with most exhaust systems, so it shouldn't matter what exhaust system you're hooking it up to. Okay, it's time to pull the passenger side downpipe off of the turbo. You're going to want to gently wiggle it off the studs and then work it down nice and slow. Just be careful not to damage the O2 sensors or get the wiring caught in anything. You're also going to want to slide out the OEM downpipe hangers from their mounts. Just be careful doing that as well, but it should come out pretty easily. After you're finished doing that, you will want to grab a TP45 Torx bit, and you're going to want to remove the bolts from the front drive shaft, this portion of it right here. Now you'll only need to remove this one side that slides into the transfer case. Once you remove all the bolts, you're going to want to pull out the drive shaft using some force and kind of push it over to the side. This will give you more room to remove the driver's side downpipe. It might be possible to do it without removing the drive shaft, but it's really tight in there. So if you were on a lift, it would be possible in my opinion, but if you're on the ground with jack stands or ramps, it's probably best to remove the drive shaft. So after you kind of figured out removing the driver's side OEM downpipe, I don't have any video of that, but it takes a little work doing it. But after you've done that, go ahead and reattach the front drive strap. There are some paint markings underneath connected to the housing and the drive shaft itself. Go ahead and make sure that those do line up when you connect them together again. The torque for the bolts are at 35 pound-feet. Okay, after wrapping that up, it's time to remove the O2 sensors from both the passenger and driver side downpipe. You will need an O2 removal tool as shown. I might get a little flack for saying this, but we did use some WD-40 to help remove the O2 sensors. It felt like Ford glued them into place, so just be sure not to get any of that on the tip of the O2 sensor. Now this next step is extremely important. You will need to swap the passenger side downstream wire, which is the blue wire, with the driver's side. Okay, again, you will need to swap the passenger side blue O2 sensor with the driver's side. Now you will need to do this because the location of the O2 sensor hole on the new driver's side downpipe, on the CVF one, is a little bit lower, so you need a little bit longer of a wire. If you don't do this, the wire will not reach the connector. It's also recommended to use some high temp anti-seize lubricant on the O2 sensor threads. You don't need to use a lot. use more of it towards the nut of the O2 sensor. And it is recommended that you torque the O2 sensors to 35 pound-feet. Okay, now that the CV Fab downpipes are assembled and ready to go, let's start by connecting the passenger side first. Now here's a quick look at the OEM donut gasket, and then here's a look at the CV Fab stainless steel gasket. Now I chose to stick with the OEM donut gasket since they were in great shape and they tend to seal really well. If you're doing this by yourself, then I would grab the passenger side downpipe and then get underneath the Bronco to help fish it up through the frame and then up to the turbo. See if you can get it to rest on the studs and then come up to the wheel well and then loosely tighten the 15mm nuts. It's much easier with two people, as one person can be underneath the Bronco fishing up the downpipe while the other can help guide it onto the studs on the back of the turbo. It will also help if the donut gaskets don't stay in place. One person can kind of hold the gasket while the other person mounts the downpipe. So once the passenger side is complete, go ahead and move over to the driver's side, and the same strategy applies here. Just take your time and you'll get it. Now the donut gasket on this side had a harder time staying in place, so I did need to hold it while Greg fished up the downpipe from the bottom and we installed it on the back of the turbo. Went ahead and loosely tightened the 15mm nuts on the downpipe as well. Okay, here's a shot of both downpipes loosely installed, and then Greg in the background questioning his life's decisions. Now we do need to remove the catback flange gasket from the OEM downpipe. You'll need to reuse this, but CV Fab does provide new nuts and bolts for the connection. Next, we're going to move on to the lower section of the downpipe. Now this did get a little tricky to install, so we opted to remove the exhaust hanger transmission mount in order to slide the hangers onto the grommets. You might be able to do it without doing this, but it was a little bit easier for us. Now I do believe the hanger uses 15mm bolts, so if you find yourself having to remove it, well, that's the size you'll need. You might also need to raise the transfer case a little bit. Over time, floor jacks tend to droop a little bit, so make sure the transfer case is still raised up. You might need to push it up about 1/2 inch to 1 inch with the jack to get everything to fit properly. Now with the hangers in place, we attach the rest of the exhaust using the provided V-band clamps. Now you'll loosely attach these for the time being, and then we'll tighten them up here in a few. Once those V-band clamps are attached, let's turn our attention back to the catback flange. It's time to use the new nuts and bolts, and then when you tighten those up, go ahead and torque them to 35 pound-feet. And after that's completed, now you can go back to the V-band clamps and tighten them up. Now make sure they're pretty snug, but don't over-tighten them. Okay, well, we are almost done. So let's jump back to the passenger side downpipe, and we're going to torque those 15mm nuts to 30 pound-feet. You can access the nuts the same way you took them off. After that's complete, let's do the exact same thing on the driver's side downpipe. Make sure you torque both 15mm nuts to 30 pound-feet. Next step is to reconnect the O2 sensors. I would normally start with the passenger side and then move over to the driver's side. If you swap the downstream correctly, you will have no issues with the wires reaching the connectors. Just to go ahead and do this the same way that you disconnected them. After the O2 sensors are all connected, now it's time to jump in your Bronco. Go ahead and start her up. Check all the exhaust connections to ensure there are no exhaust leaks. And then if you find any, make sure the connections are tight enough, the clamps are tight enough, and everything is aligned correctly. But you should be good to go at this point, so go ahead and turn your Bronco off and let the exhaust cool down a little bit before moving on. Okay, now we're going to need to reinstall the transmission cross member, assuming everything is good with the exhaust. Now to get the cross member into position, you will need to use the deep well 21mm socket and attach the nuts to the transmission mounts. Now this is much easier with an extra set of hands, but you can do it by yourself. You will need to pull the front of the gas tank skid plate down a little bit in order to slide the cross member on top of it. Once the cross member is in place, install the bolts to one side, preferably the driver's side, and then remove the floor jack from the transfer case, and then use the same floor jack with the rubber or wood blocks and help pump up the other side of the cross member into place. Feel free to use a rubber mallet as needed as well. After that is completed, Well, now it's time for torque. So you have to torque the 8 crossmember bolts to 77 pound-feet. You're also going to want to torque the gas tank bolts and the skid plate bolts, which either or depending on what your configuration is, to 59 pound-feet. Then you're going to want to torque the transmission mount, those two 21 millimeter nuts, to 85 pound-feet. And then after you're done torquing all those, you can reinstall your transfer case skid plate if you have one, and you can torque those to 26 pound-feet. Now it's time to lower the front of your Bronco or drive it down the reverse ramps. You're going to want to reinstall the wheel well liners that you removed and the fender flares. And then after all of that is done, make sure to follow the CVF warm-up procedure as shown on screen. This is very important in order to break in the catalytic converters properly. Okay, that's it. You have successfully installed the CV fabrication downpipes for the 2.7 liter Ford Bronco. Now it's time to enjoy that deep baritone exhaust and the added power and torque. Like I mentioned earlier in this video, I do plan to do a follow-up review of the downpipes and the entire Catback exhaust. The plan is to also have some dyno data to go over to show you what the gains are as far as horsepower and torque are concerned. I do want to give a big thanks to Ducati 1098 from the Bronco 6G forums. He provided a ton of helpful information to make this happen, so thanks a lot for your assistance. Hopefully a number of you found this video informative and helpful, and thanks for checking it out.